Along the fog-covered coast of Massachusetts, where the Atlantic winds carry whispers of old sins, there stands a weathered stone marker that few dare approach. Fishermen cross themselves when they sail past it, and even the boldest historians avoid speaking about what it marks. The stone bears only a date 1687, and two names that once struck terror into the hearts of every colonist, Ezekiel and Judith Harrington. For nearly 20 years, the brother and sister built an empire of accusation and blood, growing rich from the suffering of the innocent and the seizure of their land. Their downfall began when their union produced twin children so deformed that even hardened physicians fled at the sight. People whispered that divine justice had finally caught up with them. Yet what truly happened in that isolated manor, where two brilliant but twisted 8-year-olds plotted against their own parents, remained hidden beneath layers of superstition until now. Before we go deeper into the Harrington legacy, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because here we uncover the stories most would rather forget. And drop a comment telling us what state or city you are watching from, since these dark tales echo across every corner of America. The truth about the Harrington fortune and its cursed heirs reveals a kind of evil so deliberate it forces us to question what people are capable of when greed smothers conscience. Life in the Massachusetts Bay Colony of the 1660s was ruled by strict religion and constant hardship. Settlements like Wickham's Harbor, with only a few hundred souls, clung to survival through fishing, farming, and obedience to Puritan doctrine. In such places, suspicion spread like fire and fear of the devil lingered in every shadow. Ezekiel Harrington, 28, was tall, sharp-featured and known for his piercing gray eyes that seemed to see guilt where none existed. His sister Judith, 25, shared his striking looks and cold demeanor. Ezekiel commanded attention with presence, while Judith manipulated with whispers and carefully planted doubts. Their father, a failed merchant from Boston, had insisted they learn to read, write, and understand property law skills far above the reach of most colonists. When fever took both parents in 1663, the siblings inherited only a small farmhouse and mounting debts. While their neighbors turned to labor and trade, Ezekiel and Judith saw opportunity in the rising hysteria over witchcraft. Across New England, communities hired witch-finders who claimed to spot Satan's servants. These men earned heavy fees and often walked away with portions of the accused's confiscated land. The Harringtons first struck in the inland village of Milford, where crop failures and dying livestock had set the stage for panic. Ezekiel presented himself as a learned man of witchcraft signs, while Judith posed as his assistant, skilled in finding hidden marks of the devil. Their strategy was simple. They studied local rivalries, identified who owned valuable land, and then accused those people of witchcraft. Their first victim was Constance Fletcher, a widow who had inherited a grain mill coveted by her neighbors. Under the siblings' careful scheme, she was branded a witch. Marks on her body secretly inflicted during a forced examination were presented as proof. Neighbors coached by Judith testified that she muttered strange words, and the fact her mill still ran while others failed simply due to her skill in location sealed her fate. Constance Fletcher was hanged on November 15, 1664. Her mill was divided between the town and the Harringtons as payment for their services. This was only the beginning. Over the next 15 years, they accused across 8 communities, leaving 57 innocents dead and their properties seized. Their eventual marriage, shocking to outsiders, was not born of romance, but of ruthless calculation. By 1675, the Harrington siblings had amassed a fortune of more than 15,000 pounds, a staggering sum in colonial Massachusetts. They controlled property in 9 settlements, held mortgages on dozens of farms, and kept meticulous ledgers of their schemes, stretching back over a decade. Their wealth, however, brought with it a dangerous problem. Marriage outside the family risked giving a spouse both legal claim to the estate and potential knowledge of the dark methods that had built it. If either sibling died without heirs, inheritance laws could scatter their fortune among distant relatives or even let the colony seize it. Their solution was as cold and calculated as every step of their rise. Ezekiel would marry Judith in secret, binding their assets together permanently. A corrupt minister indebted to them from an earlier witch trial in Salem village conducted the ceremony on December 21st, 1675, the winter solstice. The vows were exchanged in the candlelit cellar of their manor, with only 2 servants present, silenced by threats. The marriage was hidden from the public, presented instead as a brother and sister partnership devoted to rooting out Satan's servants. The wedding was not an act of love, but a legal maneuver meant to preserve fortune and secrecy. When Judith became pregnant in early 1676, the siblings believed their scheme had succeeded beyond expectation. Her health appeared normal, and they spared no expense in preparing for the arrival of their heirs. A renowned Boston midwife, Sarah Whittam, was hired at extraordinary cost, provided with the finest supplies, and installed at the manor to oversee the pregnancy. Special foods were ordered, medicines imported, and 2 elegant mahogany cradles fitted with silk bedding were commissioned for the children. But as the months advanced, something began to trouble Sarah. By the 7th month, she noticed violent and coordinated movements inside Judith's womb, unlike anything she had felt in hundreds of deliveries. These were not the random kicks and turns of healthy twins, but motions that seemed purposeful, almost combative. "It is as though they are fighting one another," she confided to her assistant, Emma Prescott. Ezekiel dismissed her concerns publicly as superstition, yet privately he grew uneasy. He scoured medical texts, wrote to doctors in London and Edinburgh, and consulted other midwives for answers. His research confirmed that twin pregnancies could involve more intense movements. But he also found grim warnings about children born to parents of close blood. Such unions often led to deformities, stillbirths, and damaged minds. When labor began on March 15th, 1677, it stretched nearly 2 days and left Sarah scarred for life. The twins that emerged were unlike any children she or Emma had ever seen. Their limbs jutted at unnatural angles, their skulls bore strange ridges and protrusions, and parts of their bodies appeared fused by living bridges of flesh. Yet what unsettled the midwives most was not the deformities, but the uncanny awareness the infants displayed. Within moments of birth, they reached for objects, clutched at each other with startling strength, and exchanged sounds and gestures with a clarity that suggested communication far beyond their years. Despite their grotesque deformities, the twins grew into children whose intelligence was both extraordinary and unsettling. Ezekiel and Judith named them Gabriel and Raphael, hoping that biblical names might shield them from suspicions of witchcraft. Against all odds, the boys survived their harrowing birth and began to thrive in ways that defied every expectation. By their first birthday, it was clear that their minds outpaced their failing bodies. Their twisted limbs and fused torsos made even the simplest movements a struggle, yet their intellect soared. By age 4, they had taught themselves to read. By 5, they were working through mathematics, and by 7, they could hold discussions that would challenge university scholars. Their brilliance, however, was paired with a growing awareness of the darkness surrounding them. From 1677 to 1685, while the Harrington siblings reached the height of their influence, they also faced their greatest test. Raising children who were both visibly cursed and unnervingly gifted proved far harder to conceal than running their empire of accusation and theft. To the outside world, the twins did not exist. Ezekiel and Judith kept them hidden inside the manor, claiming they needed protection from cruelty and superstition. In truth, they feared that exposure of the boy's condition would be seen as divine punishment, proof of the wickedness behind the Harrington fortune. But the seclusion backfired. Shut away in their rooms, Gabriel and Raphael had constant access to their parents' records, whispered plans, and schemes. Believing their children incapable of understanding Ezekiel and Judith, spoke freely in their presence. The twins learned to remain silent and still when adults entered, absorbing every detail. By the time they turned 8, they knew everything. They understood the bribes, the false testimony, the staged evidence, and the blood of innocents spilled for land and wealth. More painfully, they realized the truth of their own existence. Their twisted bodies were the result of their parents' incestuous marriage. A choice made not out of love, but from cold calculation to keep power within the family. This knowledge bred not only grief, but a sharp, calculating anger. For the first time, the Harrington Empire faced enemies born within its own walls. Bound by their deformities, yet united in purpose, Gabriel and Raphael began to plot. They could not wield strength, but they could wield knowledge, and knowledge kept in silence for years was about to become their weapon. Their first chance arrived in the summer of 1685, when a young woman named Margaret Caldwell came to the manor seeking work. Unknown to Ezekiel and Judith, she carried a blood tie to their crimes. Her father, Thomas Caldwell, had once been a respected blacksmith in Hadley's Crossing until the Harringtons accused him of witchcraft in 1679. His land and forge had been seized after his execution, swallowed into the Harrington holdings. Margaret, orphaned and desperate, entered their home, unaware that she was walking straight into the heart of the family responsible for her father's death. What she could not have known was that 2 strange, brilliant boys inside the manor had been waiting for someone exactly like her. Margaret Caldwell entered the Harrington Manor, unaware that the very people offering her employment were responsible for her father's death. To her, Ezekiel and Judith were respected figures of wealth and influence, the kind of employers who could provide stability to a young woman left destitute by tragedy. What she uncovered inside their home, however, would spark the greatest witch trial scandal in colonial America. The twins, Gabriel and Raphael, were the ones who reached her first. Despite their twisted bodies and broken speech, they had devised a secret system of communication. While Margaret cleaned, she would find scraps of paper tucked into corners or folded between books written in shaky but precise hands. At first, the messages were small warnings and curious observations. But soon they revealed secrets that no servant should have known, hidden compartments, coded records, and even schedules of dangerous visitors whose presence meant Margaret must keep out of sight. The turning point came in September 1685, when the twins directed her to a false wall in Ezekiel's study. Behind it, she discovered ledgers so detailed they left no doubt about the Harrington Empire of blood. For 15 years, Ezekiel and Judith had recorded every payment, every confiscated property, every fee given to bribed witnesses. The pages exposed the machinery of their scheme in cold, methodical handwriting. It was irrefutable proof that dozens of innocents had been murdered for profit. But the knowledge also placed Margaret in mortal danger. If the siblings discovered her reading these records, she would vanish like the others. Margaret understood she needed a strategy, not desperation. Rather than fleeing with the evidence or openly challenging the Harringtons, she copied the most damning entries in secret and sought someone outside the colony's ordinary authority, someone with both the courage and connections to act. Her choice was Father Benedict Thorne, a Jesuit priest newly arrived in Boston from France. She approached him cautiously, never naming names at first, but gradually sharing the evidence. As she passed him her carefully prepared copies, Thorne's skepticism gave way to dread. The ledgers showed not superstition or rumor, but organized murder disguised as piety. Witnesses had been bought or bullied, property seized and divided, and entire families ruined in the name of purging witches. Father Thorne's background made him uniquely dangerous to the Harringtons. Trained in both theology and natural philosophy, he was not easily swayed by claims of supernatural mystery, nor bound by colonial politics that often shielded the wealthy. He understood the religious weight of what Margaret described, but also the cold material greed that drove it. By October 1685, he resolved to see the evidence for himself. His visit to the Harrington Manor was presented as nothing more than a routine pastoral call. But behind his calm demeanor, Thorne carried the quiet determination of a man preparing to walk into the very heart of corruption. When Father Benedict Thorne arrived at the Harrington estate, he came under the pretense of offering spiritual guidance to a family scarred by the tragedy of malformed births. Ezekiel and Judith, confident in their ability to charm and manipulate religious figures, welcomed him eagerly. To them, this was a chance to reinforce their reputation as pious guardians of the colony, and to quietly measure whether the new priest posed any threat to their carefully guarded empire. What they failed to recognize was that Father Thorne was no ordinary clergyman. His training had prepared him to see through deception, to sense the psychological residue left behind by cruelty and corruption. Within minutes of stepping into the manor, he detected what he later described as the oppressive weight of moral decay. Not a supernatural curse, but the spiritual rot born of decades of calculated murder and greed. When the priest requested to see the children, Ezekiel and Judith obliged, thinking the visit would inspire pity or perhaps sympathy. In truth, Thorne sought something else entirely. Margaret Caldwell's secret reports had suggested that Gabriel and Raphael possessed intelligence far beyond what their parents assumed. The priest needed to see for himself if the twins could become credible witnesses against the Harringtons. What he found exceeded every expectation. Gabriel and Raphael, broken in body, but brilliant in mind, showed a calm awareness that belied their age and their isolation. Despite their daily pain, their eyes carried a sharpness and a hope that shook the priest deeply. They did not fear him. They welcomed him as if they had been waiting their entire lives for someone with the authority to challenge their parents. With desperate urgency, they tried to share what they knew, gestures, scribbled notes, fragmented words, all pointing toward the crimes committed in the rooms around them. Thorne recognized the signs. In his ministry, he had counseled survivors of torture and persecution, but never before had he seen such maturity and determination in children so young, so trapped, and so utterly dependent on the very people who had caused their suffering. When Thorne departed the manor, the exchange of pleasantries could not mask the truth. A battle line had been drawn. The priest now understood the depth of the Harringtons' corruption, and the siblings, in turn, sensed that this visitor was no easy pawn. He asked too many pointed questions, lingered too long in the wrong places, and carried himself with a quiet certainty that threatened their security. For the first time in 2 decades, Ezekiel and Judith felt real danger. Back in Boston, Father Thorne began his investigation with precision and purpose. Unlike colonial courts, the Catholic Church possessed networks of informants, legal scholars, and administrators skilled in building cases against the powerful. Within 3 weeks, he had assembled a damning dossier. Financial ledgers from colonial banks exposed the flow of blood money. Relatives of victims gave sworn testimony detailing how the Harringtons had orchestrated false accusations. Most devastating of all was the confession of Marcus Fletcher, a former accomplice who admitted to planting evidence and coaching witnesses at the siblings' direction, all in exchange for coin and protection. Piece by piece, the empire Ezekiel and Judith had built on fear and superstition was beginning to collapse under the weight of undeniable proof. Marcus Fletcher's confession exposed the Harrington Empire in all its brutality, from how they selected victims and manufactured evidence to the ways they bribed officials and rigged trials. More damning still, Fletcher revealed that Ezekiel and Judith had married each other, not only to protect their fortune, but had openly discussed using their malformed children as curiosities for private exhibitions to wealthy patrons fascinated by medical oddities. This revelation horrified even Father Thorne, who had already been hardened by decades of ministering to victims of cruelty. The siblings had not only condemned innocents to death for profit, but had deliberately brought children into the world as tools for both secrecy and exploitation. Yet the most powerful evidence in Thorne's case would not come from ledgers or accomplices, but from Gabriel and Raphael themselves. In secret interviews arranged by Margaret Caldwell, the priest discovered that the twins carried memories of conversations, schemes, and abuses that aligned perfectly with the written records. Far from damaged or delusional, the boys demonstrated moral clarity and intelligence that made their testimony impossible to dismiss. What they described went beyond neglect into systematic torment. They recalled being subjected to painful medical experiments without anesthesia, forced to solve complex tasks under threats of starvation, and treated as specimens for their parents' twisted theories about the link between deformity and intellect. Worst of all, they revealed that Ezekiel and Judith had been documenting their growth and behavior with the intent of selling these reports to European physicians eager to study the effects of incest on human offspring. By late 1685, pressure on the Harringtons was mounting from every direction. Father Thorne now held evidence that could not be ignored. Yet he moved cautiously to avoid provoking a violent backlash that might cost lives inside the manor. Meanwhile, Gabriel and Raphael became bolder, secretly creating caches of written notes that cataloged their parents' crimes and future plans, evidence Margaret herself could never safely gather. Their defiance did not go unnoticed. Ezekiel and Judith, long blind to their children's capabilities, began to sense the threat growing within their own household. They did not respond with parental concern, but with suspicion and hostility, viewing the twins' growing autonomy as a danger to be contained. The breaking point came in December 1685, when Ezekiel discovered signs that someone had been rifling through his private ledgers. The false wall in his study bore faint scratches. Hinges showed wear, and dust no longer settled where it should. Worse, he found that the most incriminating pages, records of bribes, forged testimonies, and fraudulent property seizures had been marked with near invisible pencil dots, clear proof of systematic study. At first, Ezekiel's suspicion fell squarely on Margaret Caldwell, the servant with reason enough to hate him. He and Judith turned on her with the same cruel interrogation tactics they had once used to break accused witches, but under pressure, Margaret revealed knowledge that was damning, yet incomplete. The siblings realized with growing dread that she could not have been the only one combing through their secrets. Someone else inside the manor had been studying the forbidden ledgers, and all signs pointed toward the two children they had once dismissed as helpless burdens. The idea that their own children had been quietly gathering evidence against them for months was so alien to Ezekiel and Judith's worldview that it never crossed their minds. They had grown too comfortable seeing Gabriel and Raphael as broken dependents, bodies twisted beyond usefulness, and minds assumed too fragile to matter. That blindness proved fatal. While suspicion fell on Margaret Caldwell and Father Thorne, The true danger lay inside the manor, where the twins sharpened their minds into weapons their parents could not imagine. Using scraps of paper-coded sounds and subtle manipulations of objects, Gabriel and Raphael created a private language that allowed them to coordinate even when separated. What their parents saw as crippling limitations had instead forced them to become keen observers and strategists. By December of 1685, the children had assembled a devastating archive, ledger's notes, overheard conversations, and even records of plans not yet executed. They knew the Harringtons were preparing to push their operations into the Connecticut River Valley, where fear of Indian raids could be twisted into profitable witchcraft trials. Worse, they learned of whispered discussions about accidents that might conveniently end the lives of 2 disabled children during the long winter. Preparations for their disposal had already begun. Gabriel and Raphael responded not with panic, but with cold strategy. They chose not to flee, not even to simply warn Father Thorn of the danger. Instead, they crafted a plan that mirrored the very methods their parents had perfected, using deception, timing, and the manipulation of appearances to trap their prey. The boys understood their own vulnerability. They might not survive the struggle to come, but if their deaths dragged Ezekiel and Judith's crimes into the light, justice for the dozens of murdered innocents would finally be possible. The moment arrived on December 21st, 1685, the 10th anniversary of their parents' secret marriage. For Ezekiel and Judith, the winter solstice was more than a date. It was a private ritual of triumph, an evening when they dropped the mask of piety and celebrated the unholy partnership that had made them rich. For Gabriel and Raphael, it was the stage for their final gambit, a carefully laid trap that would bring everything crashing down. Just when it seemed the horrors of Harrington Manor could sink no deeper, the night of December 21st, 1685, revealed how far the darkness would spread. If this story chills you, share it with a friend who loves sinister mysteries, hit the like button to support our work, and make sure you subscribe so you never miss tales like this. Now let's step inside the night the twins struck their final blow. Gabriel and Raphael's plan demanded flawless timing, unshakable resolve, and a courage beyond their years. Though barely 8 years old, and though they had never stepped outside their prison home, they had developed the clarity and discipline of seasoned investigators. Their strength lay in what their parents could never comprehend: the sharp vision of the oppressed and the brilliance to turn suffering into strategy. The solstice was always their parents' private anniversary ritual, a twisted celebration of their incestuous union and the empire of blood it had created. Every year, Ezekiel and Judith locked themselves away to count profits, review the list of the dead, and map out new victims. The children's chamber just beneath the ritual room had given the twins years of unwanted access to these ceremonies. They had listened to the recitations, memorized the numbers, and prepared for this one night when it would all collapse. By 1685, the Harringtons were preparing to abandon Massachusetts, their names too tainted and their profits waning. Carolina beckoned with its promise of fresh fear and untapped wealth. That night they gathered the ledgers and maps that traced their crimes, unaware that their children had already created hidden copies, caches of evidence placed where discovery was inevitable. More chilling still, the twins had spent months weakening the house itself, studying architecture from their parents' library, fashioning crude tools from scraps, and applying principles of weight and pressure until key supports were fatally compromised. What looked like a solid home was now a trap of timber and stone waiting for the right moment. Father Thorn arrived at exactly 7 o'clock, his plan disguised as a simple pastoral visit. But behind him stood something far more formidable than piety. Colonial officials carried arrest warrants. Clerks prepared to seize records, physicians waited to examine the children, and even an engineer stood ready to dismantle the house if needed. Thorne's experience as a military chaplain in Europe had taught him the value of planning, and he had mapped every escape route, every window, every staircase. He knew this night allowed for only one attempt. If Ezekiel and Judith suspected too soon, they would kill everyone inside before surrendering their empire. Inside the manor, the siblings reacted with practiced calm. For 20 years they had turned away suspicion with ease, and at first they treated Thorne's knock as another annoyance. Yet as he entered and spoke of Margaret Caldwell's welfare and of offering guidance to a family enduring hardship, a subtle shift crept into the room. His tone was too measured, his eyes too steady, and the timing of his arrival too precise. For the first time, Ezekiel and Judith sensed a threat they could not so easily control. From the moment Father Thorne stepped inside, his calm authority unsettled the Harringtons. His questions cut too close, his knowledge of their household too precise. When he asked to see Gabriel and Raphael, claiming he wished only to pray over the children, Ezekiel and Judith hesitated. Their instinct was to refuse, as they always had, citing fragile health and nervous dispositions. But this priest was different, and they knew that outright denial would raise suspicions they could not afford. Reluctantly, they agreed. It was the decision that ended them. Inside the twins' chamber with their parents looming over them, Father Thorne gave the agreed signal. At once Gabriel and Raphael answered not with timid whispers, but with the clarity of children who had rehearsed for this exact moment. Their broken voices carried accusations sharpened into weapons. They began reciting crimes with the precision of a ledger. Names, dates, places, payments, evidence hidden and evidence planted, all of it poured out in relentless sequence. On the night of September 14th, 1679, Gabriel said slowly, each word forced through pain but deliberate. Our father and mother met with Marcus Fletcher in the cellar to plan the accusation of Thomas Caldwell. Mother paid Fletcher in silver, taken from Rebecca Whitmore's jewelry. Father gave him instructions for hiding the puppet in Caldwell's barn. Without pause, Raphael continued seamlessly, his voice ragged but steady. He confirmed the meeting, described the cellar, even recalled the smell of burning tallow candles that lit the conspiracy. Each testimony dovetailed perfectly into the other, forming a chain of detail too precise to be fantasy, too damning to be ignored. Ezekiel and Judith had spent years believing their children to be helpless shadows. In that moment they realized too late that those shadows had been watching, listening, and remembering everything. The puppet contained hair taken from Caldwell's youngest daughter during a forced medical search the parents had staged to find marks of witchcraft, and Fletcher had been instructed to hide that puppet beneath the anvil in Caldwell's forge where witnesses would be told to look. Hearing their most secreted crimes recited by their own children in the presence of a priest who had the power to act destroyed Ezekiel and Judith's composure. And for the first time they faced a kind of betrayal they had never imagined. Victims they had expected to be helpless, suddenly naming names and places with cold accuracy. The twins did not stop there. Gabriel and Raphael, who had memorized years of theft and murder, described hidden caches of jewelry and goods, the web of bribes that had kept magistrates blind, and the carefully buried bodies no one had thought to link to foul play. Raphael pointed to the chest beneath the east study floorboards and counted as if reciting scripture 37 pieces of jewelry taken from executed women, including the wedding ring of Mary Hutchkins, who in 1681 had been accused by our father after he poisoned her cow, and then used the dead animal as evidence of witchcraft so he could seize her 12 acres and her late husband's tools. The children's testimony matched ledgers and letters Father Thorne produced, and the physical facts of the twins' existence made their words impossible to shrug off as fancy or madness. Instead of remorse, Ezekiel and Judith slid immediately into calculation. Their first gambit was to discredit the children to claim illness and delusion. But Thorne already had corroborating documents and independent witnesses lined up, and the attempt to gaslight the room collapsed. With denial exhausted, the Harringtons moved to their contingency plan, the one they had kept for when exposure was inevitable, unleashing hidden weapons, probing secret escape routes, and preparing to burn or bury the evidence, while they fled with coffers and false papers. Father Thorne and the officials around him reacted with the urgency the situation demanded. But the manor itself had been turned into a weapon by the twins in ways their parents had never expected. And as the first cracks in the house began to give, under the careful pressure the boys had arranged, the final hour of the Harrington Empire started to unfold into a collapse neither greed nor brutality could prevent. Would you like me to keep going and rewrite the actual collapse and aftermath in the same style? The violence that followed was swift, chaotic, and brutal, but it unfolded exactly as Gabriel and Raphael had planned. For months they had studied their parents' emergency drills, anticipating every weapon, every escape route, and quietly crafting countermeasures to ensure that this final confrontation would end in justice. When Ezekiel pulled a concealed pistol and leveled it at Father Thorne, the gun burst apart in his hands. Gabriel had sabotaged the weapon weeks earlier, slipping small shards of metal into the barrel until it became a trap waiting to spring. The explosion shattered Ezekiel's grip and left him bleeding and unable to fight. Judith's turn came seconds later. She lunged at the colonial officials with a knife hidden in her bodice, only to plunge through a section of weakened flooring Raphael had deliberately prepared. The fall stunned her, and as she struck the ground, a series of mechanisms the boys had rigged snapped into place, barricading doors and windows, cutting off every path of escape. The final showdown erupted in the manor's main hall. For months, the twins had undermined key support beams, mapping weight and pressures so carefully that even master builders would have been impressed. Their calculations allowed for a controlled collapse, creating safe pockets for their rescuers, while sealing off the Harringtons' last desperate bid for freedom. Trapped and cornered, Ezekiel and Judith turned their fury on their children, intent on silencing them forever. But the house itself became the twins' ultimate weapon. At their signal, the central supports gave way. With a roar of splintering timbers and crashing stone, the manor folded in on itself. Beams crushed Ezekiel and Judith beneath tons of debris, their final expressions frozen in disbelief that the children they had dismissed as weak had orchestrated their downfall. The destruction revealed more than bodies. Hidden rooms cracked open, spilling caches of jewelry ledgers and the skeletal remains of victims thought lost to rumor. The collapse did more than end the Harringtons' escape. It laid bare the physical evidence of 2 decades of blood and theft. And symbolically, it destroyed the very prison that had confined Gabriel and Raphael since birth. When the dust settled and rescuers clawed through the wreckage, they found a scene of haunting clarity. Ezekiel and Judith lay dead beneath the rubble, crushed by their own empire of lies. Gabriel and Raphael, battered but alive, sat sheltered in the alcove they had engineered with their remarkable precision. Though frail in body, they were fierce in spirit, ready to testify against their parents and expose the full scope of their crimes. Their survival was more than a miracle. It was a declaration. Against every cruelty and limitation, they had proven that truth, courage, and justice could emerge even from the darkest of prisons. The collapse of Harrington Manor sent shockwaves across Massachusetts, reverberating far beyond the smoking ruins. The evidence pulled from the wreckage, combined with Gabriel and Raphael's unflinching testimony, proved beyond doubt that the siblings had engineered a campaign of judicial murder, unlike anything the colonies had ever seen. Within days, courts issued posthumous convictions against Ezekiel and Judith Harrington on 57 counts of murder, along with fraud, bribery, corruption, and conspiracy. Legal scholars would later call it the most comprehensive criminal prosecution in early American history. But the case did not end with 2 dead criminals. The Harrington revelations forced colonial authorities to confront the terrifying possibility that other witch trials had also been poisoned by greed and manipulation. Father Thorne's investigation uncovered evidence of similar abuses in neighboring communities, suggesting that the weaponization of supernatural accusations for profit was far more widespread than anyone dared admit. The result was a sweeping review of witch trial procedures and the beginning of reforms that would eventually dismantle the culture of persecution. The Harrington fortune itself became another battlefield. Over 3 years, officials unraveled a blood-stained empire worth more than £25,000. Special courts were convened to trace properties seized through false accusations and restore them to the surviving families of victims. The scope of the fraud shocked even seasoned magistrates. Records salvaged from the manor revealed meticulous bookkeeping maps of stolen lands, ledgers of bribes, and projections for future schemes in other colonies. It was not hysteria that had fueled their enterprise, but cold arithmetic. Amid this reckoning, Gabriel and Raphael emerged as living proof of resilience. Royal physician Dr. William Harvey traveled from London to examine the twins, expecting to find helpless invalids. Instead, he discovered children whose supposed limitations had been exaggerated by years of neglect and deliberate manipulation. Under proper care, their physical condition stabilized and their intellectual brilliance shone even brighter. What their parents had tried to exploit as a curse became instead a testament to human endurance and the power of truth. With proper medical care, steady nutrition, and careful therapy, Gabriel and Raphael began to change in ways that astonished everyone who saw them. Their bodies, once thought hopelessly frail, grew stronger, and their minds, already sharp from years of forced observation, flourished when given the freedom to learn. Within months, they were reading at levels far beyond most adults, solving mathematical problems that impressed university scholars, and producing art so intricate it drew praise from intellectual circles across the colonies. Dr. William Harvey recorded their progress with meticulous care. His reports, later published in Europe, became some of the earliest texts in the field of medical psychology. They challenged centuries of assumptions by proving that intelligence could not be measured by outward appearance or physical condition. Instead, Harvey showed that with proper care, education, and opportunity, even children who had endured the harshest beginnings could reveal extraordinary gifts. The twins' testimony remained central in the legal storm that followed. Their clear memories of conversations, bribes, and staged evidence tied together the vast body of documents recovered from the ruins. More than that, their moral clarity, children who had every reason to remain silent yet chose to speak, made them witnesses whose words no one could dismiss. With their help, prosecutors secured convictions against dozens of accomplices who had enabled the Harringtons' reign of terror. Psychological evaluations conducted by Harvey and his colleagues revealed something even more remarkable. Despite years of isolation, cruelty, and manipulation, Gabriel and Raphael showed no signs of lasting mental instability. Instead, they displayed resilience, empathy, and an innate sense of justice that seemed only to have been sharpened by suffering. This resilience allowed them to adapt quickly to life beyond the manor, earning the respect of neighbors who initially viewed them with suspicion or fear. In time, the twins themselves reshaped public opinion. No longer seen as cursed anomalies, they became living proof of what could be achieved when society chose inclusion over rejection. Their presence strengthened arguments for the education and recognition of people with disabilities, showing that human potential was not bound by the body, but by opportunity. As adults, both left indelible marks on colonial society. Gabriel became a respected legal scholar, his writings on judicial corruption and the protection of vulnerable witnesses directly informed by the horrors of his childhood. Though limited physically, he advised courts on criminal cases across New England and introduced some of the first procedures designed to safeguard children who testified. His ideas paved the way for special courts protections for the disabled and improved methods of gathering testimony, foundations of modern legal practice that still echo centuries later. Raphael devoted his adult life to medicine, focusing on children born with physical differences and on victims of cruelty who had endured what he once suffered. Known across the colonies as Dr. Raphael Harrington, his approach was revolutionary. He treated patients not as curiosities or broken bodies, but as whole people deserving of dignity, education, and community. He founded the first school in colonial America dedicated to children with disabilities, proving that with proper support and opportunity, limitations of the body did not define the potential of the mind. The success of his institution challenged long-held prejudices and inspired the creation of similar schools, reshaping how society treated its most vulnerable. Both brothers built families of their own, raising children untouched by their parents' physical struggles or their grandparents' corruption. Their ability to form stable, loving homes became a powerful testament to the fact that trauma, no matter how deep, need not dictate the future when healing and support are provided. Their lives offered living proof that resilience could not only mend what was broken, but build something greater. The Harrington case itself reshaped colonial society. Father Benedict Thorne's investigation became the blueprint for how to confront powerful corruption. His meticulous methods, gathering records, protecting witnesses, and presenting evidence with care, set standards for both religious and civil authorities. His written account of the case was copied and studied across New England, teaching future generations how easily evil could flourish when fear replaced accountability. The ruins of Harrington Manor were left standing as a warning. The site was declared a memorial funded by the confiscated wealth of the family and preserved as a place of education. Visitors learned not only of the horrors committed within its walls, but also of the courage it took to bring them down. Upon the stone marker raised at the grounds, Gabriel and Raphael chose the inscription themselves. Here lies the evidence that evil is not supernatural. It is a human choice made by those who value comfort over conscience. Let all who pass remember that justice depends on the courage of those who refuse silence in the face of wrongdoing. In the end, the Harrington case did more than expose corruption or dismantle an empire of blood. It proved that even the weakest voices, in this case, two broken children, could topple the strongest oppressors. And it left behind a lesson that echoed through courts, churches, and classrooms for generations, that every child, no matter their condition, carries dignity and moral agency that must be recognized and protected. Gabriel and Raphael's courage in exposing their parents' crimes while completely dependent on them for survival shattered colonial assumptions about disability, childhood, and moral responsibility. Their voices proved that children could be both victims of cruelty and agents of their own liberation, a lesson that helped shape later ideas about child protection, education, and human dignity. The twins' legacy reached far beyond their own time, influencing early debates about disability rights, victim advocacy, and the prevention of systemic abuse. Their story challenged the prejudice that physical limitations defined worth showing. Instead, that intellect, resilience, and moral clarity could thrive even under the harshest conditions. The Harrington case still resonates today. It reminds us that communities can become complicit in evil when fear and superstition drown out reason and compassion. Ezekiel and Judith succeeded for nearly 20 years, not because of any supernatural power, but because they exploited human weakness and turned suspicion into profit. Their downfall came not from divine judgment, but from the courage of those who refused silence, 2 children trapped in their own home, and a priest determined to stand against corruption. So what do you think of this story? Do you believe the Harringtons were unique, or were there other witch hunters in colonial America who used superstition as cover for murder and theft? Leave your theories in the comments. I'd love to hear how many so-called divine judgments you think were really calculated crimes. And if this tale gave you chills, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves the darker side of American history. Join me next time as we uncover another forgotten case of colonial evil that most people would rather leave buried.